Welcome to Women's Wisdom, a series on sensuality, sexuality, love, power, and other issues that support the honoring and empowerment of women's experience in the world now and into the future. The inspiration for this series and the topics themselves were raised by you, the women we've met while touring the country, leading women's circles and conversations. There were so many overlaps in the concerns and narratives women shared that we wanted to bring dialogue out into the open. Rosebud Woman is a family-owned company that is all about reverent, intimate wellness for all stages of a woman's life. We are dedicated to bringing more joy and reducing suffering in minds, hearts, bodies, and culture around the female experience. Consider this series as our gift to you. Hello. I'm Lisa Betts-Lacroix, and I'm your host for Women's Wisdom, a series brought to you by Rosebud Woman. Today's show is our 8th in a series of 9 episodes, and if you missed any of our conversations with past experts, you can be sure to visit the YouTube channel, the Rosebud Woman YouTube channel, and YouTube page, where you can hear and follow some of the amazing conversations we've been having with our guests and our ambassadors. We've been talking about the body and the legacy of shame that so many of us carry in our culture, and which we're now linking arms to dispel. We have been discussing ways to nurture ourselves, ways to nurture our bodies and our inner worlds, and the role that language and words and culture all play in our identity and in our connection to ourselves and to each other. Today, we'll be talking with Antonia Roraback. Today we'll be talking with Antonia Roraback, a co-founder of River City Gems, a social support group for the transgender community in Northern California. Antonia is a beautifully kind person and is open to all of your questions. So if you're following us here today, please be sure to drop them in the comments box so we can get to them. So without further ado, let's welcome Antonia to our show. Hello, Antonia. Can we hear you?
I think you can now.
Great.
Good.
Hello. Well, thank you for taking the time out to talk with us today.
It's my pleasure.
I'm wondering if we could just start by maybe giving us a little bit of an introduction into your own personal journey, because obviously your personal journey informs so much of all of the work that you're doing now and the impact that you're wanting to contribute to society through your group, through the support that you do in your community group, and even just by coming on here and sharing your personal experience.
Well, my personal experience goes back quite a few years. And when I give you my first experience, you'll understand how far back that goes. I remember very vividly, I was about 9 years old. I don't remember exactly, but pretty close to 9 or 10 years old. And I was riding with my father in his pickup truck. And my father had the radio on, and it had a report coming on the radio, and it said, man transitions to being a woman. And her name was Christine Jorgensen. And I can honestly tell you that when I heard that, it just resonated so deeply within me that how is that possible? Because inside of me, there was always that thought of not really being exactly what I was told I have to be, that I was kind of different. And so my journey really kind of began then. And as with most trans people, I began to experiment with makeup and experiment with different things that would give me the sense of being more feminine than I was allowed to do. And it was, all in secret. And so that was the beginning of a over 50-year journey to where I am today. And Um, I guess I don't want to leave this part out. One of the life lessons that we learn in being transgender is that we tend to put ourselves in a place of feeling disgust about who we are. We feel like we've done something wrong, and we suffered from that all the way up until about 10 years ago, when the community began to evolve. And then we began to realize that, well, wait a minute, we have something to offer. We're, we have a gift, it's not a curse. And
Hmm.
so my transition over those years was primarily in the closet, coming out occasionally, hiding in the closet. And so, in a nutshell, that was really my experience in getting to where I am today, in the midst of transition personally.
Right. Wow, what a journey that is. And as we were talking about before we started recording, I'm guessing that your experience as a transgender person during the age and the stage of our cultural evolution that you were raised in is probably a very different experience than might be the case for trans people who are 3, 4, 5 decades younger.
Oh, absolutely. The trans community today, we always tease them and we say, "You've got it made." Um, it we can actually go in public, just as I met Christine, in a
Mhm.
public setting. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we were still meeting in closed private rooms, um, having to have our own private restrooms for fear that if we went into the hotel or any of the venues restrooms, that we would be laughed at and criticized and perhaps even asked to leave. So it's been a real revolution in the last 10 years, and I'm very happy for that.
Now, one of the things you mentioned that we could talk about was just the idea of how we got here. Is there something that you have thoughts on in terms of how it has come about? Has it been through just our general cultural awakening and opening to the possibility of diversity and non-binary everything, really? I mean, I would say that we're increasingly growing an awareness of the fact that human beings are not binary in all ways. And so I don't know if that's part of it, or is there something else that you were referencing when you were saying that we could talk about how we got here to this new different experience of being trans in 2020?
Well, I think you covered it quite well. I mean, it is basically a revolution that started with the youth in our world, not just in this country. There are other countries in the world that are even more open and more accepting of the trans community than even here in the United States. In the United States, there are really only small pockets in the urban areas that are open and caring. But you get into some of the more rural areas of our country, it begins to become a whole different scenario. So the youth really was a springboard for us.
Mhm.
But added to that was the LGBT community itself. When Harvey Milk got everyone to understand that being gay was not a sin, that that it was your mailman, it was your accountant who were gay, and he introduced them. Well, the T at the end of LGBT was kind of a forgotten group. The movement really didn't embrace the transgender segment. And it wasn't until about 20 years ago that the trans movement began to say to the LGB, we're part of you. And we want to ride with you on your journey. And so that work by the activists from our trans community got us linked to the gay lesbian community, that it made it possible for us to now have identity, and which we had nothing like that on the national scene. So it was a win-win for everybody, I think.
But obviously, the experience of being trans is radically different in many ways to that of being
Yeah,
LGB.
yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can share some of the specifics. Now, that might be a little bit of a general question, but how would you say, or what would you say are the essential and most impactful aspects of the unique experience of being trans compared to the rest of the larger community?
Well, trans to start with is not a sexual experience. It is not. It doesn't really reference your sexual orientation. Um, so its uniqueness is that it lives within what we call gender,
Right.
because you know, unfortunately, society has lumped those two together. That sex and gender mean the same thing, but in truth, sex and gender don't.
And I guess that is complicated when you put yourself in part of that larger community, when you're part of the LGB, because those are specifically referencing
Yes.
sexuality. And so you're putting yourself in a group of people where that distinction. So I can see how that does make for some complexity of understanding.
Right. And that's the key word. It was all about understanding. They really didn't have an understanding of how we were built and how we felt. And once they got to know us and understand that, you know, this is more about who we are as an individual, that they began to not fear us, but began to embrace us. So like I say, it was a win-win.
Yeah, since we're there already, why don't we actually talk about language and about pronouns and about, because one of the things that's occurring to me as you're speaking is that in addition to the LGBT labels, there have been other labels that especially I think have grown from the young people, the movements in the young people that are saying, hey, these don't even necessarily represent who we are. And so like terms that come to my mind are non-binary or gender non-conforming, or like there's a lot of terminology as people try to dissect or pull apart or separate sexuality and gender identity and all the variations of it.
Well, as everyone knows, we live in a society, global society, where everything has to have a label.
Right.
Without labels, we don't seem to be able to understand the concept of anything. So the labels that were consistently used were the ones that began to be challenged by the youth, by the trans community, and saying, we would like to be labeled in a way that would represent who we are and how we identify. To walk into an office or into a building, uh, identifying female, and have someone say him, he, it's embarrassing, and and sometimes it's even done intentionally to
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 deny,
to bring notice to who you are.
right?
So the pronouns are a very, very important aspect of social development, because we still live in that binary of, male, female, and and it just creates a difference in how we communicate with each other. So um, and keep this in mind too, pronouns are changing all the time.
Yeah.
They're being added to, some are being taken away. Some of the labels that we used to have when we were called transvestites, we were called cross dressers, we were called all of these other things. They've kind of moved a little bit away from that, because now we have what's called the transgender umbrella, which covers the broad spectrum from someone who occasionally enjoys wearing feminine clothing to someone who is fully transitioned, living their life as a female. So everybody fits underneath that little umbrella, or big umbrella, today.
So that's interesting. And I'm really always fascinated about language, and especially I'm really fascinated by labels and how we identify ourselves, because I think that it does reflect our identity and it reflects our inner worlds, even though you can certainly find reasons to dismiss or to undermine or to not want to necessarily be labeled, for sure.
Mhm.
But there's a there's a reflection that it always offers. And I don't have any personal experience, obviously, with the transgender experience, but what I relate it to is race, because I have a lot of different experiences. I identify as mixed race. And so I I do believe that labeling matters, and so I'm very specific about my calling myself mixed race
Yes.
because that speaks to me more than say biracial or other
Yes.
labels that I could choose. And I guess the question that I have around that is, how, for me, the way that I see that is I get to decide which label I use for myself. Somebody else might use a different label for a very similar biological experience as mine, but they identify differently, and I've always held that I get to choose, regardless of my blood quantum percentages, regardless of my phenotype, what I look like, regardless of how you see me, regardless of how I'm treated in the world. I get to choose my racial identity and how I name it. And it seems like that would translate pretty directly to the experience of whether you want to whether a transgender woman wants to say I'm a woman or identify specifically as a transgender woman. Because I'm kind of wondered about that as I even wrote up the notes to here. Can I call you a transgender woman, or are you just a woman?
And that is an excellent question. Um, you will find in our community some that really rely heavily on being identified as a woman, period, and become very upset when you don't classify them as a woman. Because you have to remember that the experience for them to become a woman, while they weren't biologically formed as and when they first came into the earth, they 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 had to do immense changes to make that happen. I mean, just 200 or 300 hours of electrolysis on their bodies, facial feminization surgery, top surgery, bottom surgery, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And for them to take that and then for someone to disparage that by not identifying them as what they felt they had moved to,
Mm-hmm.
is huge. On the other side of the spectrum, many of us more recently have become more aware that it's perhaps better to call ourselves trans women, because we don't seem to ruffle the feminist movement quite as much when we do that.
Well,
Because the
that's not what I
feminist,
was expecting you to say.
yeah,
Interesting,
yeah.
because you don't seem to ruffle the feminist movement. How does that fit together? I'm not quite following that.
Well, there are a lot of hardcore feminists, if you go online, that speak very disparaging about transgender community, and simply because they don't want men who transition to be a female, they don't want them to claim to be a woman. You can be a
Oh,
trans woman, but you're not a woman because you
okay,
weren't
so
born.
that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. What I was actually thinking about, as I'm guessing must be the case for some people, that there's a specific identity to being a trans woman that's unique to being a woman. In some ways, in so I can completely see that some people would choose one or the other, because some people just are like, I spent this energy, this is who I am, I'm now reflecting who I actually am, I'm a woman. And other people would say part of all the progress and the process that I went through to get to where I am includes this journey, and therefore the identifier trans reflects the larger journey. That's my
Yeah,
guess. Is that right?
yes. Um, and to add to that, the reason we're now using trans woman is because it's accepted. Uh, if you were to even use the word trans in anything 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it was had a negative connotation. But now that, people accept someone who's trans, the stigma is gone. And so we can now be trans women. And it, like I say, it is more conforming to um, the bigger picture, the more bigger social picture, where the early girls that transitioned early in life, they really had to live in stealth. They had to disappear from their male life, and so it was a lot different from them. So a woman, it was the only thing they wanted to hear, and that's changing. So,
Right.
you know,
Wow.
and I'm glad it is personally. I'm glad.
Let's talk a little bit about what you identify as your inner call to authenticity. I take it that that stems back from this very early seed stage of when you were, I think you said 9 years old, and you recognized this as a possibility. And obviously, that's not something that even when you recognize it in that moment, it happens overnight. That call is probably quite a journey, and probably has many layers of authenticity to it, is my guess. Is there something you could share about your story and specifically with relationship to authenticity?
Well, looking back, um, I always knew that I identified with a group of people who were feminine. The at school lunch, I sat with the girls. In my neighborhood, I played with the girls. I was never someone who sought out the boys in the neighborhood and to become good friends with them. And that's not to say I didn't have any male friends, but I knew my leaning was always toward things with more feeling, with more depth. I loved conversations and communication, and I couldn't find any of those in my male counterparts. So, you know, but I didn't identify any of that until I got older. So you don't identify what you went through until you move on and
Yeah.
look back and say, oh, that's why. That's how come I feel that way. That's what really resonated with me because um, it's not just about wearing makeup. It's not just about the clothing, while I enjoy both. It's really more about connection with a spirit like me. Just like our conversation we're having right now is delightful because I'm speaking to someone who I can relate to, if nothing but inside.
Right. Right. And some of that obviously is individualized, right? I mean, but you're basically saying that there's a kind of a collective orientation that women more likely share
Yes.
between us that you related to more.
And not just me, that's really the story of most transgender women. They'll
Right.
tell you this, our stories have common threads, and that's one of the common threads that it has, is that most of us had that feeling, had that desire uh, to coexist in a different environment than the male environment.
So when I was growing up, even people who were gay were so not able to be out and open about who they were. You know, I'm 55, so I'm a little bit younger than you. But at that time when I was growing up, it was not, especially in the high school ages, it was hidden. Like,
Yes.
and that's almost amazing when you think back now at how extensive that is, to me at least. And I'm wondering if the experience you just described, the way you were inclined to hang out with the girls, was that by other people or by you at any point perceived as being gay?
Well, I can't really say. Um, I can answer it with a more current experience.
Okay, great.
Um, because when I came out to my work companions and I came out to my family, because not everyone in my family knew, and it's a very large family. And the response that some people gave when they heard or I told them was they said, now I understand a little bit more. It doesn't surprise me. So our actions are just normal for us. We don't realize that we're different.
Right.
It's just our natural way of living life.
Yeah.
And, you know, so there's possible that people perceive me as being a sissy or whatever, but I was living my life at that time and I didn't care.
Got it. Got it. That
Yeah.
makes total sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So when you talk about relationship, because relationship is so central to the collective that we'll call women, I think
Mhm.
the female experience is so central. Relationship is so central to it, and before we started recording, you talked about the fact that for trans people, relationships in general are really can be challenging. We were talking about romantic relationships specifically, but I'm really sensitive to the fact that you just said you have a big family and coming out was a process, and you also told me you have 6 kids and many grandchildren, and I'm really wondering how I have a lot of compassion for what that must have been like. I can only barely begin to imagine because it seems very complicated and complex when you add in all of those elements. And I'm wondering if you would share some of what's probably, I have to imagine, fairly vulnerable and fairly delicate on an emotional level, but probably pretty rich and possibly illuminating for those of us who haven't experienced it.
Well, I have to say that it was my decision to transition full time, not just occasionally to dress up and go out, but decision to live full time was probably the most difficult decision I've ever made in my life. And I've made some difficult decisions, and this would top them all. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that I do have within me a large field of compassion and understanding for the emotions of people around me. And what it was so hard is that I'm taking away from my children, I'm taking away from my friends the person that they knew for a lifetime. And I think that what made it possible for me to do that is I had a continual dialogue with my children probably for the last 15 years. And they watch me go through some of the transition stages. And it wasn't until I had all of their support and all of their love that was shown to me that I realized that I could now make that choice. I mean, at this age,
Wow.
it was.
I feel kind of choked up on that because it's almost like this beautiful metaphor of your children in a way kind of birthing you, like raising you up, and in some kind of way where I think what you're saying is that you actually wanted to have, you actually worked on the process with your children until they actually could give you their full, you know, blessing.
Yes,
Or
yes,
that's
yeah.
amazing.
And it was something that took time. It wasn't something that could happen um, too quickly, because some of our community did take action much earlier in their lives, when their children were small, when their careers were moving along well, and they suffered the consequences, unfortunately. Although I would never say that they did something wrong, because what they did is what they had to do. For me personally, I felt I wanted to be in control of my choices and my decisions and how they impacted other people. And just a little sidebar, my name is Antonia.
Mm-hmm.
And I picked Antonia because my male name is Anthony. And I did that because I wanted to be able to still reference to my nickname that my children and family have always called me, which was Tony. So
Oh.
now I'm Tony with an I instead of a Tony with a Y.
Mm-hmm.
So choices and decisions that I made, um, even though it was difficult to move away from them, I think I kind of embraced them a little bit more by being sensitive to those things.
It sounds like your path to creating, to making that decision, and especially integrating conversations with your children into it must have in some ways really deepened your relationships with them, would be my guess.
Yes, yes, it did deepen the relationship with them, and as I said to you earlier, I'm turning 75 in 2 weeks, so I'm not quite 75 yet, and I'm going to celebrate that 3/4 of a century with my children and usher in a new era. And hopefully I'm well enough and fit enough to put in some serious years behind this and be part of, a new part of my family. So, but my journey has just begun. I'm a long ways from being where I need to be.
Can you say more about that?
Well, I have facial feminization surgery scheduled on March 24th. And um, without getting into too many details, the feminine face is a lot different than the masculine face. And that is the one thing that seems to identify people more quickly as to male or female when somebody just looks at you quickly. So many of the girls, and myself included, we're having facial feminization surgery, which is very brutal. And I won't get too into the details, but uh, they cut your body apart, your face apart in multiple pieces and shave bones and reshape things and pull skin. And, it's a surgery that takes almost a year to where you can actually start feeling your face again.
Oh, wow.
Because, it's a shock to your system to,
Mm.
peel your face off and then restructure the skeletal underneath it and then put the face back over. Um,
Wow. Yeah. I I can I I just had hip surgery and I have nerve damage in my leg and I still don't really have feeling in my leg. So I guess I'm trying to apply that to the face and that's which is so much more in the world and so much more your presence in the world that seems like a deep journey.
well, it's a part of the journey that has with it the the golden ring or the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Because I know that when I look at my face in the mirror, I don't hate what I see, but I know that when this is all done, I'm going to love what I see. I'm going to see finally the face that I've always seen, even though it didn't manifest itself. So, um, with only maybe a few exceptions, most of the girls have shown that in their comments, and you can see the evidence in videos on YouTube. So I'm excited and can't wait for that, to happen for me.
Wow,
Yeah.
amazing. We have on some of the other shows talked about hormones because it's an issue for people either who are coming into womanhood and getting their periods on one of our shows or women who are going through menopause and having their hormones changing radically. And so we've talked a lot about hormones over the course of the last 8 episodes. And obviously that has to be a journey that you're engaged in as well from a completely different perspective. So I'm wondering if you can share what you know about hormones, what you've experienced and ways that might be illuminating for our audience or even relevant in some unusual way.
Well, as we all know, hormones really have a key role in who we are as people, how we function. Men having huge amounts of testosterone, very little estrogen, and vice versa for women. A huge amount of estrogen. So the only thing I can share with you is, my experience in doing away with my testosterone to levels to where there's zero now. I'm so delighted with having estrogen in my body because it does everything I wanted it to do for me. It's
Hmm.
it's it's my hair on my face is growing much slower. Uh, my skin is much smoother. Um, my face is taking a little bit of a different shape. Um, breast development begins. Um, and all of these things are things that you admire and want and almost fantasize over to some degree that, finally I'm experiencing that. So that's the positive side. On
Mm-hmm.
the negative side, Yeah, we experience a lot of the things that women experience with hormones, with estrogen. Mood swings become a lot more noticeable. Um, Crying at things, just, why am I crying?
Mhm.
And all of a sudden you see that happening. Um, some of the girls break down in sweats, like they're going through menopause. So, the reaction that a man has to going on estrogen is pretty severe, but to me, a good severe.
Right. So I'm wondering about that because so many people in between our age range say how our women are dealing with hormone replacement.
Mhm.
And that just to even bring our hormone levels, like I actually haven't experienced that yet, but I know that what that does, it brings your hormones back to levels closer to where they used to be.
Right.
How does the level of hormone replacement or hormone addition, or what do you call it, hormone therapy,
Right. Replacement. Yeah.
hormone replacement that you would do compare with a premenopausal or a postmenopausal woman?
Well,
Or does it compare?
I don't really know for sure because I'm not in that world
Yeah.
of understanding how women have to use hormones other than that they do.
Uh-huh.
Um, but I'm assuming that some of the reactions are very similar. I think that's if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, I don't know what I'm asking. I'm just kind of curious about how, I mean, yeah, I understand it. You're saying that you can't really speak to that because you're only doing it from the
Yeah.
perspective of your experience, and so that's fine.
Well, I can add this that male to female transgender women
Mhm.
have to rid their body of testosterone. I mean, they want you to be at zero, no testosterone.
Okay.
The side effects of that is you totally lose any libido that you had as a man.
Relatively speaking, yeah.
Relatively speaking, it goes away. And it's almost, for me, it was like a gift
Uh,
because those emotions and those feelings that I had with my testosterone weren't always positive feelings and positive emotions. Um, and you are constantly fighting some of the urges that those emotions bring on to you. And I don't want to get into a whole story about men and testosterone and how they feel their needs and those kinds of things. But truthfully, I find it very, very relaxing not to have to deal with those any longer. Um,
Interesting.
it's just kind of a moot point for me, and it frees my mind to be a little bit more at peace and at ease, because being heavily driven by testosterone can have it's just like women who are driven by amounts of estrogen, so are men. So, you know, now the trans men who take testosterone, they want the results of having more testosterone, which is
Hmm.
facial hair growth, voice change for them because their voice, will change with the testosterone, um, and so it's a trade-off depending on which way you go.
Yeah, and then I'm assuming that then they're having to integrate this new aspect of their experience in the world that comes from the hormones, that's more the emotional or physical or sexual parts into their new identity too.
Yes, absolutely,
So
and yeah, absolutely.
we talked before we started recording about the fact that trans people have a unique insight into the world in that they have experience in in both realms, and we're talking hormonally, but also in other ways. I'm wondering if there are other experiences that you could share from having this unique insight into having lived as a man and lived as a woman, hormonally, physically, societally, socially. Like there's so many elements, I'm sure.
Well, I can address a little bit on the social aspect of it. I, I, I don't have a lot of personal experiences that would maybe answer that question, but I know as a community, I heard about a lot of experiences, especially those that are still in the workforce. I'm not in the workforce any longer, where when they transition from male to female, all of a sudden things change in the in the workplace for them. They're seen differently than how they were seen as a man. Um, they're oftentimes treated with less respect than they were as a man. So all of a sudden they begin to take on a lot of the issues that women have suffered under. And I use that term because I really believe it was a suffering that women have had to live with for years and years and centuries. And so they begin to experience some of those things. For example, not being taken seriously when they have ideas and thoughts in the workplace. All of a sudden, they become idiots. Where they were very intelligent when they were men, but now that you're transitioned to a female, you've lost all your intelligence, and that is really, really difficult for us to grapple with because it's unfair. And so we get a feeling of what it's like being in that position. I'm trying to think of other
No,
areas.
that's a really important point, and I think what I would concur on that from the other side, because as I mentioned to you, for my own show, I've interviewed a trans man, and he concurred with that completely. He said that one of the things that he was completely surprised by, and in some ways had very mixed feelings about, is that he was suddenly taken seriously where previously he had not been.
Yes,
And it was very marked and very, very, very clear to him that that was the experience, and that that was quite a surprise. So it's not just on the female side where you say, hey, we're not being taken seriously. He experienced that also, like all of a sudden places where he would have been maybe dismissed, all of a sudden people were listening to him.
yes.
And yeah, and he was pretty shocked by that.
To give you another experience, when I worked and walked in the world as a man, I never carried mace. Now that I walk in the world and I'm out by myself, I carry mace because the experience that some of our girls have had from men because they identify as women, and even if they what we call pass
Mm-hmm.
remarkably,
Mm-hmm.
there's a certain level of vulnerability that they experience, criticisms, and so there's a fear factor that raises, especially being that you've been on hormones for a period of time. Those senses or those feelings seem to be elevated. So yeah, there's times when I really say, boy, I know what it's like being in that place right now. And it creates within me an overwhelming connection with um, who I am and who I am now affiliated with or associated with. I want to be with the women. I want to
Yeah.
be with their movement. I want to be with, whatever they push for. And I hope that we are able to do that. I hope that we bring strength to women's movements um, by being vocal about the injustices to women.
Uh, that's really interesting because it's the second time you referenced the feminist movement earlier in our conversation, and it's honestly something I hadn't thought all that much of as someone who hasn't experienced what you experienced. And I think that it's a really powerful point that you're making, that in some ways your experience can actually empower and support in ways that might never have been supported in the past by women who've always been women. And so that's really, really a powerful point that I hadn't occurred to me, because you really do understand, well, from so many different places, the experience from different.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. In the experience that I go through, um, we feel that that support is far-reaching within. Um, oh yeah, I lost my thought for a second.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, so if we stand up for who we are, if we step forward from our male to female self, and we say we embrace who we are, we embrace being female, we feel that that is being authentic, being real. And we feel that what women really want in society is to be seen, to be accepted, to be wholly part of the community rather than being subjected to a specific place. And so our coming out and our marching and protesting and saying we all need to be equal, we all need to be considered as human beings, no matter what our gender is, no matter what our sex is. So we feel like we're really kind of promoting that group that is trying to find a place in society.
Definitely. That makes such sense. And again, what I'm hearing is it's another voice in the collective
Yes.
for the freedom and I love how you articulated this deep need that so many women experience and don't always have, and that's the experience of being seen and recognized and honored and taken seriously and all those pieces. And so
Yeah.
yeah, it seems like my sense from you is that you've done whatever inner work you've needed to do and that you've been on a journey over decades such that your experience in transitioning, at least as you're representing it to me now, and the feeling that I get seems like a beautiful answering or a beautiful arrival or a beautiful process of arriving in a place where you want to be. And I would actually not put those words in your mouth, but ask you that also. But before I do, I'm wondering if I'm guessing that there's still a lot of pain in the larger collective of the trans community, and that there is still a lot of challenge, emotional challenge that people face. And I'm thinking of this largely because we're talking about safety. And I know that trans people experience violence on the streets to a much higher degree than most people do. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to, because it seems important to presence, the challenges that are still faced in spite of all the trend, in spite of all the change and the growth and the awakening that we have about what's fair and what's right, that trans people are still experiencing now, and that you must see by being in and by being the co-founder of a community support group.
Well, there certainly is a great fear that we still see on the horizon. We we don't take anything for granted. It's kind of like, okay, we've made 3 steps forward, but we have to be careful because we have to keep pushing, because there are forces that want to keep pushing us 3 steps back and putting us in a place that they want us rather than where we feel we're obligated to have and deserve to have. I think that's perhaps answering your question, that what we see on the horizon, while positive, we try to keep a very positive aspect of where we're reaching for and what we want. Um, and we see a lot of community support, um, hospitals, doctors, uh, educators, uh, all beginning to look at things from a different perspective. And we feel those are seeds planted in the base level of our society that will sustain over a period of time, to where the forces trying to put us down will be mitigated, will be stopped through their efforts to support us. And we rely heavily on that, and we're thankful that we do have it. So,
What does the organization that you are president of, and that, can you talk a little bit about River City Gems and the co-founding of it and the role that it plays in supporting people right now?
absolutely. It's a topic that I love to talk about. Um, we there was a group of us. We formed a small group here in Sacramento, 13, almost 14 years. And the biggest concern we had was we saw a suicide rate in our community at in the high 30s, even into the 40 percentile, which is which is terrible.
Terrible.
And um, and a lot of it came from the fact that 20 years ago you just didn't come out. And we felt that if we couldn't address things from a political standpoint because it was really muddy and murky back then. So the decision was, well, let's do something social. Let's build a coalition around social activities and social events. And while they started out as being private events in different locations, and there was 20 or 30 people, but at least gave some people that first opportunity to just actually go out of their door, because most transgender individuals, and I want to say clearly that whatever statistic that you hear about how many transgender people there are in this country, quadruple that, because they're all in the closet. Trust me.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
meet them every single day. The ones that just dress once or twice a year. Um, and so we wanted to start a group that allowed them access to meeting other people like them and doing it in a social environment. And it has evolved, to where we have actually 3 events a month now, and most of our events now are public venues, where we interact with people, which has been very stimulating for our group, because now we could sit down next to someone like yourself and we can have a conversation with you, and we find people interested in us, curious. That's okay. I don't mind the curiosity, because it gives me an opportunity to express myself. So now the group is expanded to where we have a lot of interaction with the public, and we call it planting seeds. And so the River City Gems has stayed the course. Most groups that form as transgender groups sometimes don't last any more than 3, 4, 5 years, because they get involved in the whole political you know situation. We stayed away from that. So we're a social group. We go have fun.
I mean, I
And
think you're hitting on something that is deeply human, which is that we don't feel like we can be our authentic selves, and we don't have connections from that place. We experience disease and, inner pain that, of course, that makes sense that that's connected to suicide. So I can see the impact that you must be making in creating the opportunity for people to make those connections and to have a place to be as they become more authentically true to who they are. So,
yes, I could reel off a half a dozen stories of people who have come to our events for the first time with their spouses.
can you
Now,
tell one?
yeah, there was one couple from the San Jose area. I won't mention any names.
Of course.
That he had tried to commit suicide twice, and went to a therapist, and the therapist unearthed this emotional part of him that he had so suppressed so much in his personality, because that's what trans people do. They suppress their feelings constantly, because they're just afraid of being outed. And that was his experience. Very successful in business, and went to one of our events. It was what we call our luau, um, Hawaiian theme, and we had it at one of our members' homes. And they became active members. He never transitioned, but he does live occasionally in a feminine role. Uh, his wife is very supportive. So he moves in and out of the masculine and the feminine, because that's what he prefers to do. But we feel we had a hand in helping him get rooted so that suicide no longer is an issue. And that's just one story. We've had many in our community who have faced suicide and are now with us because we
Amazing.
existed. Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So, am I correct in my perception that you're on a journey that's feeling quite beautiful and quite true to you? I mean, all aspects of life have their challenges. I know, I recognize that piece too. But can you say a little bit about what your personal experiences are? You, at one point, you said you're just beginning, and what I heard was, in some ways, like you're just beginning this next phase of your life that has a lot of possibility for contribution too.
Well, it is emotional. It has its moments of being a roller coaster,
Yeah.
because you're leaving behind something that I have nothing but good things to say about my life. I'm proud of the things I have accomplished and the people I've helped is in my male role in life, and I'll never forget those. But I'm so excited to find out what my journey will bring to me, because every time I move a step forward, it creates these new little experiences that I never thought I would experience. An example, I went hiking with a friend. I'm a big hiker, and I went hiking with a friend, and I've always worn more like Levi's when I've gone hiking. And she showed up and she had a pair of tights on. And I looked at her and I said, I got a pair of tights like that. I'm going to go wear them. And how I felt hiking with those tights on versus my Levi's was a whole different feeling.
Mm,
And so it's those little moments that I'm beginning to experience. People in the store coming up to me and not treating me like I'm a man, but treating me like I'm female. And a lot of them don't even know that I used to be a male. So, those are just so reinforcing of my decision to do what I'm doing. And, you know,
beautiful. Yeah. And I also really deeply appreciate the point that you're making and underlining that I think is true, is generalizable to all of us. And that is that whenever we change, whenever we grow, there's the newness of what's possible and what we're becoming, and we're always letting go of something from the past. And I think that's such a deeply rich and true element and aspect of being human. So I really appreciate your raising, that the emotional aspect of that we doesn't matter how perfect it is, the direction we're going, we're still leaving. And I experienced that with my kids growing up. I love my adult kids and I miss all the ages and stages they were before.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, so thank you for that. Is there anything that we didn't talk about or that I asked you that you think needs
Mm.
to be said?
Well, nothing that I can see on my list.
Anything that your heart's calling to?
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you
Oh.
for the opportunity to do this. I spoke to some of the people on our board. We had a board meeting last night, and I told them that I was going to be doing this, and I was excited to be able to, speak for our community and again try to resonate more closely with the females that we interact with, and most importantly, to give them an understanding of our deep love for them, deep love for the nature of being female. And so I really want to
There's
thank you.
Thank you. And there's some real woman's wisdom, which is that we do get stronger together
Yeah,
and we are a collective, and it's all about our linking arms together to recognize our collective experience as women. And so thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your energy and for your sharing your stories and your world.
you're welcome.
Just hold on one second. So thank you for being here with us on Woman's Wisdom by Rosebud Woman. We will be back next week for our final episode in this season's Woman's Wisdom series. We'll see you then. What is reverence? It's a way of living in awe and amazement at these outrageous, complex, and beautiful bodies, at the mere fact that we are alive at all, and to treat ourselves, each other, and the earth as if it was all a treasure, because it is. Be assured that anytime you feel small or contracted, there's a lie involved. Because the truth of you is perfect nature, perfect wholeness, always more than enough. The stories that we learn from family and culture, from thousands of years of culture, have often made the feminine less than, denigrated, or demeaned. We leave these stories in the past. We don't pass them on to our daughters and granddaughters. Knowing our worth, we step forward into this new moment, knowing that all of the world is a blend of male and female, and each element asks for celebration. We shine out and make a world that works for all women everywhere, starting with ourselves. Thank you for joining us at Women's Wisdom by Rosebud Woman. For more information and past episodes, please visit us at www.rosewoman.com.